So this week's portion begins by telling us about the second of our patriarchs, the story of Yitzchak, and of course the second of our matriarchs, Rivka, and more precisely the birth of their two sons, Yaakov, who becomes the heir apparent, and Esau, the more iniquitous son. And the opening of the portion begins with a very curious wording. These are the children of Yitzchak, the son of Avraham. Avraham begot Yitzchak. Now, the obvious question is that we know all about Yitzchak's birth already from actually two portions ago, which tells not just of his birth, but of his brit, his circumcision, his bar mitzvah, and his spiritual coming of age when his father Abraham was taking him at the age of 37 to be sacrificed on the mountain in the story of the Akedah. Last week, Yitzchak is already a man of 40 when he gets married to Rivka. So why does this week's portion feel the need to tell me something that I already know from a long time ago? This is introducing us to Yitzchak, the son of Abraham. Abraham begot Yitzchak. And you know what? Often the answer lies in the question. Why indeed the redundancy of the wording? Yitzchak, the son of Abraham, Abraham begot or gave birth to Yitzchak. Rashi, the commentator par excellence, quoting from the Medrash, explains that the Torah here is actually telling us something more. Of course, we already know that Abraham was the father of Yitzchak, but not everybody necessarily believed that. Not everybody necessarily knew that. You know how people like to be cynical and how people like to gossip, how people enjoy spreading rumors, however false they might be, because it makes for good dinner table gossip? Well, consider this. Let's remember, recapping, Abraham and Sarah are married for years. They don't have any children. Then one day, visiting the land of the Philistines on account of a hunger, Abraham and Sarah are somewhat wary about the inhabitants of the land. And so Sarah tells the Philistines that Abraham is her brother. Whereupon the king, Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, immediately takes her for himself. Now, the Torah itself readily attests to the fact that nothing happened between them. Indeed, God immediately punished Abimelech, prompting his own defense. Hey, it's not my fault. I didn't know she's a married woman. She said that Abraham was her brother, that I'm her sister, not her husband, not my wife, not his wife. And he immediately sets her free. So we know that. We know that Abimelech took her and then immediately released her, but not everyone else knows that. The cynics will say, and they did say, for all these years, Abraham and Sarah could not have children. She's taken in by Abimelech, and what do you know? A little while later, she's clearly pregnant. 9 months later, baby Yitzchak is born. And so they insisted from Abimelech, was Sarah impregnated? Now, the absurdity, of course, is in the fact that Sarah herself was 90 years old. So if it was a miracle for her to have a baby, then obviously it could be a miracle for Abraham at age 100 as well. But a cynic is a cynic, and a gossip monger is a gossip monger. It's boring to talk about miracles. It's much more entertaining to suggest Avimelech, not Abraham, is the real father. God responds to this cynicism by ensuring that Yitzchak looked identical to his father. They literally looked like identical twins, such that it was undeniable that Abraham and not Avimelech was the father. Now, here's a little fun fact. Even as people grew old, obviously even then back in the day, and certainly died of old age, they didn't necessarily look older. Abraham and Yitzchak looked identical. Not that they looked so much alike, but obviously father. A lot of people tell me, oh, you look so much like your father. But literally identical. When you looked at one and you looked at the other, you didn't necessarily even know who you were talking to. But because of the confusion, and it was so overwhelming and proving problematic, and you didn't even know if you were talking to father or son, at that stage, Abraham actually asked God to give him a more aged appearance. In other words, until that point, people didn't typically look old. They aged, they became old, they died of old age, but they didn't necessarily appear to be old. So in this instance, Abraham and Yitzchak looking identical to each other, but literally because Abraham did not appear to be any older than Yitzchak, and they had an identical appearance. But he asks God, give me a more aged appearance so people will be able to distinguish between us. And the point is that from only then and going forward, was it the case that as you grew older, you looked older? In other words, if you want to complain about your wrinkles and your gray hair, you need to take it up with Abraham. But it begs a bigger question, a much bigger question. Fine, there are cynics, and there are mockers, and there are scoffers, and God therefore retorts and responds by way of making Yitzchak look identical to Abraham. So everyone knows Abraham is the father and not Abimelech. Why does God find it necessary to perform this unusual miracle of making father and son look identical in the first instance, just to silence the scoffers? Why does it matter? People want to deny the miracle of Abraham having a baby at 100. So be it. People deny miracles all the time. It's their problem. Why does God consider it so important to intervene, to stop it? And a fascinating answer takes us back to the story of the Akedah. You will remember that Abraham was tasked with the challenge of taking his son up the mountain to sacrifice him on the mountain. And as father and son are trekking up that mountain, there is an interesting exchange. In the words of the Torah, and Yitzchak, who was then about 37 years old, said to Abraham, his father, and he said, Father? And he said, behold, I'm here, my son. Now, some suggest that that exchange reflects what might have been going on in Yitzchak's mind at that moment in time. You know, when people mock and people scoff and rumors abound, you're going to hear about it too. And sometimes when you do, you might indeed start to maybe entertain it yourself. You might even start to believe it yourself. By way of a somewhat absurd example is how myself and my older sister used to tease my younger sister that she was adopted. I'm not sure why we chose to tease her with that, nor did I necessarily know the extent to which she started to believe it, until I noticed one day my mother very innocently hanging her birth certificate on the fridge in the kitchen. Clearly, there was something going on there. My parents needed to redress the balance. Look, see, the birth certificate mentions my mother's name as the birth mother to my younger sister, Sharon. In a somewhat similar vein, but much more than that, it's not just a couple of siblings. The rumor is out there. The gossip is being spread. The cynicism cuts deep. Everybody's saying, a lot of people are saying Abimelech is the father of Yitzchak. So deep that Yitzchak himself starts to maybe believe it himself. Or at the very least wonders whether his own father entertains that possibility. In fact, what compounds the belief is the very fact that his father is taking him to be slaughtered. I mean, if you're my real dad, how could you bring yourself to do this? Maybe it's true after all. Abimelech is my real dad. Maybe you yourself, Abraham, harbored doubts about the timing of my arrival into this world. Maybe you also wonder whether you are the real father. Yitzchak says the words of the verse, Abi, my father. In other words, are you my father? Do you believe you're my father? And Abraham replies, Hineni b'ni, I am here, my son. My son, I believe with full confidence that I am your father. But nevertheless, I'm bound to fulfill God's command to sacrifice you, my beloved son. So God ensuring that Yitzchak and Abraham look identical was as much maybe for Yitzchak's sake as it was for all the other scoffers. And the point is, we see just how impactful cynicism can be. The scoffers' cynical charge that Yitzchak was fathered by Abimelech had such an effect that for a moment Yitzchak himself wondered and even suspected that his righteous father might have believed it too. And more to the point, the cynicism of those who sought to mock, it didn't remain in clubs or dining room tables. It reached the Akedah, one of the most sublime, spiritual, powerful moments in human history, causing even Yitzchak to entertain doubts, if only for a brief moment, as to whether Abraham was truly his father. Cynicism, as some suggest, is like a shield smeared with oil. You know, if an arrow is fired at the soldier, he lifts his shield and the arrow strikes the shield, and because of the oil, it slides right off. Similarly, it is said, cynicism shields a person. By definition, everyone who hears the mockery is shielded, is prevented, as it were, from spiritual growth. The words that are being spoken cannot penetrate. A rabbi or a speaker can deliver an emotional, uplifting talk, but all it takes is just one cynical remark by someone in the audience to ruin it all, to shield everyone in the room from the inspiration that could have otherwise penetrated and they could have received. That's why God intervened to counter the scoffers, to show that Yitzchak was truly Abraham's son. If their cynicism was capable of reaching even the Akedah, then surely it was capable of perhaps inflicting yet greater harm and sabotaging Abraham's efforts to spread monotheism, the belief in God, throughout the world. And God intended to counter that outright, and so he did. That's one analysis. Then there's another fascinating point to consider. Yitzchak, the son of Abraham, Abraham gave birth to Yitzchak. You know, the question, nature versus nurture. It's a debate as old as time itself. Here's the question. We're talking about the great Abraham. We're talking about the great Yitzchak. Then Yitzchak has a great son, Yaakov, but he also has an Esau, wicked, cruel Esau. He was a murderer. He was a serial adulterer. He was an idolater. How on earth does wonderful, great, spiritual Yitzchak end up with a wicked son like Esau? I mean, it's a pure genetic line. Abraham, Yitzchak. How does Esau come next? Unless come along the gossip mongers who say, see, told you. Yitzchak was born to Sarah, but was fathered by the Philistine king Avimelech. Avimelech, wasn't the most savory of characters either. Look how he was ready to take Sarah at first pounce. You want to know how Yitzchak has an Esau? It's the bad gene being passed on through Avimelech. In other words, the birth of Esau gave rise to the gossip and the cynicism all over again. And you know, whenever the Torah, commentaries explain, whenever the Torah says the son of or the daughter of, it implies nature. Whenever the Torah says so-and-so gave birth to so-and-so, it implies nurture. In other words, when it says Yitzchak, the son of Abraham, that would mean nature. Abraham begot Yitzchak, that means nurture. Nature is innate, it's intrinsic. You can't shake that off. You can, to be sure. It's not impossible, but it's a formidable task. Nurture, on the other hand, can be much more readily discarded. Hence, you find in reference to Ishmael, Abraham's other son, he's referred to as the son of Hagar, whom Abraham begot. Ishmael was a rogue. How so? He was the son of Hagar, an Egyptian princess. He had her Egyptian DNA. That's what enabled him to be the way he was. That was his nature. But Abraham begot Ishmael. Abraham nurtured him. It worked for a while, but as we said, it can be readily discarded. And we know that later he went down a rather negative path. In the end of his life, he reverted back to a virtuous path. The nurture kicked back in. In our context, when the Torah says Yitzchak, the son of Abraham, that's nature. Abraham is his father, and he shares his father's DNA. And then Abraham begot Yitzchak. Yitzchak was nurtured by Abraham as well. In other words, he was Abraham. He was an extension of Abraham by nature and nurture through and through. Again, putting paid to the cynicism and the mockers. Okay, so where does Esau come from? That's, after all, what gave rise to all the rumors. Continues the verse, Yitzchak married Rivka, the daughter of Besuel from Padan Aram, the sister of Lavan. Esau has a mother as well, and his mother, Rivka, is commonly referred to as a rose amongst thorns. Her father, Besuel, was one thorn, a real rogue of a man. Her brother, Lavan, was another thorn, a swindler of the first degree. Even where she came from was a real unsavory place. Oh yes, a bad gene from her father gets passed through her into her son Esau. That's how Esau comes to be. The question then that we have to consider is, does that then mean that one's fate is sealed? If you have a certain genetic disposition, is that all you can be? Is there no fighting the system? It's in your DNA, end up. A father had two sons. One was exceptionally happy and positive about everything in life. Even the darkest day was bright. The other was always sad and despondent. Everything was black and bleak. Every opportunity was really just a catastrophe waiting to happen. The father was determined to redress the balance somewhat, and so took radical measures. He went to the bedroom of his rather negative son and filled it with every imaginable toy. Surely this will bring him immense pleasure, he thought. He'll see what he has. He'll be grateful. He'll be happy. He then went to his forever happy child's room and proceeded to fill it with buckets, forgive me, of horse manure. This should bring him a little down to earth, he thought, and he walked out of the room. And that evening, as the boys go to their respective rooms, he sneaks behind the door and he listens in to their reactions. The sad son is crying away. He barges in, he goes, son, what's wrong? Why are you crying? He goes, Dad, look at all these toys. I'm going to have to spend hours reading through the instruction manuals. The batteries are going to go dead in no time. Some of them are going to break. My friends are going to be jealous. It's so not worth it. And the father leaves the room dejected, walks down the hall towards the other son's room, where he hears him laughing with glee. He opens the door and he's gobsmacked to see his son jumping up and down on top of this mountain of Eeyore. And he says, son, what's up? What are you so happy about? He goes, Dad, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere. You know, there's a major misconception when we think that children are born inherently good. The reason we think this is because many Jews, certainly those that are theologically clued up, assume that as Christianity believes in original sin, then for us, the opposite must be true. We're born good, wrong. The fact is that we're born, you might say, parav. Indeed, with a propensity towards evil. The Torah itself says that the inclination of man from infancy is towards evil. The goal of parents is to recognize that, notwithstanding this inclination, man is also created in the image of God, and our purpose and our mission statement as parents is to steer the child, to nurture the child towards that image. Babies are cute, but that doesn't mean they're good. In fact, babies are the most self-centered creatures around. They want what they want, and they'll terrorize you if they don't get it. We have the physical nature of an animal and the spiritual potential to be godly. We're born animalistic, and it's parents' objective to nurture the greater godly elements which lurk beneath the surface, to steer the child toward more godly objectives. And how do we do this? Through discipline and with lots of love. Let's consider. Our sages compare Esau to a pig, because a pig, though as non-kosher as they come, always puts out its front legs while crouching down to show off its split hooves. One of the signs of a kosher animal, as though to declare, look, I'm kosher. Hence the verse tells us, and Yitzchak loved Esau. This wicked child managed to charm his way into his father's heart. And yet, are we to assume that Isaac Yitzchak was so readily deceivable? He was an astute businessman, as the Torah attests to. He was just a brilliant man. It's truly likely that Esau, with some smooth talking, I mean, really, could he really fool him? And I suggest to you that Yitzchak was perfectly aware of his son's smooth tongue belying his malicious heart. But what are we supposed to do when somebody goes bad? Just write them off as another statistic? Just ignore the innate potential that lurks at the core of every soul? Says the Torah, Yitzchak loved Esau. Yitzchak really cared about Esau. It doesn't matter how bad the child might become, how bad the nature might be. The umbilical cord doesn't become severed. Children need love, especially when they don't deserve it. And so Esau goes out to kill and to steal and to commit numerous hideous crimes. He takes the wrong kind of wife. He violates every one of his father's principles. He discards the textbook of values of his ancestors. And Yitzchak loved Esau. He knows that children are a blessing sent from God above for us to care and to nurture, and most of all to love. And that there are many paths that a child can take, right or wrong, will remain unknown. But rest assured that in the end, with the right kind of nurturing, it'll all lead back home. And that's why Yitzchak wants to give, as per the story later on in the portion, he wants to give special blessings to Esau. He wants to do what he can to help his son. And in precise appreciation of the powerfulness, the potency of the blessings, who knows, maybe, just maybe, by bestowing them upon Esau, it's worth the risk. It might yet turn him around. In fact, it is interesting that the sages use the analogy of the pig to describe Esau, because it is the same sages who in fact tell us that in Hebrew, the Hebrew word for pig is chazir. And chazir, or chazar, also comes from the root word chazer, which means to return. And the sages tell us, chazir asit lehitar. In Mashiach's times, the pig will return to become kosher. Yeah, that's right. By then, we'll be able to find out what all the ham and bacon fuss is all about. So therein lies the point. In as much as that's the reality in regard to a chazir pig, Esau is compared to that. By definition, Yitzchak is looking to discover the potential of turning Esau back, of making him kosher, of bringing him home. It wouldn't have been easy for Yitzchak. His primary characteristic himself was that of might, strict discipline. But when it comes to reaching out to the needy child, crying out for love, you've got to summon the strength and the patience, even when it may not come naturally. Children need love, especially when they don't deserve it. And let's remember, Children is not defined by any age bracket because ultimately we're all children. There are two compelling consequences that emerge as a result of Yitzchak's choice attitude. First, on the man-man level, it is said that from the day that Esau evoked this compassion from his father, he assured that no righteous man should ever see real evil within their own children, which we can take to mean quite simply, if Yitzchak can do it, even with a son as challenging as Esau, then we can all do it with one another. And secondly, the Talmud tells us that in the future, God is going to say, my children have misbehaved. They're undeserving of my compassion, of my mercy. And all the good and glory of the past will rise to beseech from on high for their children, but only Yitzchak will prevail. Because Yitzchak will be able to step forward and declare, I had compassion for my son, even as he was undeserving. So too, you should have compassion and show mercy to your children as well. And incidentally, I would add this one final observation. Very much later on in the portion, after the whole blessing saga between Jacob and Esau, the Torah tells us that Yitzchak sent Yaakov away. In the words of the Torah, Yitzchak sent Yaakov away to Padan Aram, the place where his brother-in-law Lavan lived, the son of Besuel, the brother of Rivka, who was the mother of Yaakov and Esau. And Rashi steps in again and says, I don't even know what it's coming to teach us. In other words, we already know who Rivka is. The whole portion is discussing about her and her interaction with her children. What is the Torah teaching us suddenly by repeating over here something seemingly random, that she was the mother of Yaakov and Esau? Yaakov went off to Padan Aram to be by his uncle Lavan, who was the brother of Rivka, who was the mother of Yaakov and Esau. And I suggest to you the following. Earlier we are told Rivka loved Yaakov and Yitzchak loved Esau. Esau was a rogue. He was a terrible troublemaker. He was a wicked person. But you know what? He's still Rivka's son. And Rivka is still his mother. Lest you think that Rivka is disconnected from her evil son, says the verse, Rivka, the mother of both Yaakov and Esau. She's a Yiddish mama, and he's a Yiddish kind. And then Rashi says, I don't know what it's coming to teach us. And these words, I think, Rashi himself is teaching us something very profound. Of course, she still cares about him. Of course, she's still his mother. Maybe she loves Yaakov, but there's plenty of space in her heart for Esau as well. You know, earlier today, my son called my wife in panic. He's unable to pick up his own son in time from nursery. Could my wife go instead? So she turned up at the nursery and a new teacher on duty. Who are you? I'm the grandmother. I'm sorry, but we cannot just have any random stranger walking in here claiming to be the grandmother. The parents ought to have called us and let us know first. My wife explains it was all last minute, it was all urgent, no time. Can you tell me his date of birth? Now, I don't know how many of you know off the cuff your grandkid's date of birth. My wife certainly didn't. So it's really not going well for her. Meanwhile, another teacher is bringing Emmanuel, my grandson, out. My wife leans down, opens her arms wide. Emmanuel, come to Safti, and he bursts into this huge grin, runs straight into her arms with glee, smiling, hugging tight. My wife looks to the teacher. Would he do this to a stranger? Now you tell me. Am I the grandmother? And off they went together. Rashi says, I don't know what it's coming to teach us. In other words, tell me something I don't already know. It's a given. Every mother, every parent, every one of us ought to be there always for someone else with open arms. That's the lesson, the bigger lesson that we ultimately learn from the story of Yaakov, Esau, and indeed their interactions with their beloved parents, Yitzchak and Rivka. I wish you all a beautiful Shabbat.